This is a big statement to the popularity of the Beatles that 40 years after the killing of John Lennon, books are still being written on this topic. In today's video, we're going to talk about Yoko Ono's influence in John Lennon's life and how she sold a cow for $250,000. Stay tuned to find out. The latest work on John Lennon, the Beatles, and the events of December 8, 1980, when Lennon was gunned down by his deranged fan Mark Chapman in New York, is done by well-known crime writer James Paterson. The book, titled The Last Days of John Lennon, was released this year. Many people believe that the last days of John Lennon were some of the best days of his life, even though the world-conquering Beatles had pulled the plug on themselves. In 1980, he was 40 years old, and his partying, drinking, and harsh relationships were also behind him. 5 years earlier, he and Yoko Ono, his so-called artist wife, had their son Sean. Lennon took a 5-year break from music and the limelight. He dedicated himself to domesticity, bread baking, and raising the newborn baby. Ono wore the pants, investing Lennon's almost $150 million fortune into property, art, and Holstein cows. Lennon told Playboy in one of his last major interviews, which appeared in the magazine's January 1981 edition, that when he was cleaning the cat shit and feeding Sean, he was sitting in a room full of smoke with men in three-piece suits that they couldn't button. However, he was working on his comeback when he was murdered. Ono has often been criticized for the disintegrations of the Beatles. She would refer to the band's other members, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison, as the three in-laws, but Paterson doesn't agree with that opinion. In an interview, Paterson said, "People incorrectly criticize her for breaking up the Beatles. I think John was just prepared to move on. He wanted to make more serious art. He was always inclined that way, and I think that's why he chose to be with Yoko. I think that John's the reason the band broke up, not Yoko." Lennon's fortune was too massive and complex to understand easily. For the longest time, the couple did not really know how much money they had, but Ono was clearer about her investment strategy. She once revealed that, to make money, you have to spend money, but if you're going to make money, you have to make it with love. I love Egyptian art. I make sure to get all the Egyptian things, not for their value, but for their magic power. Each piece has a certain magic power. Also with houses, I just buy ones we love, not the ones that people say are good investments. And then there were cows, almost $6 million worth of them, Lennon said. Sean and he were away for a weekend and Yoko came over to sell this cow and he was joking about it. They hadn't seen her for days. She spent all her time on it. But then Lennon read the paper that said she sold it for $250,000. Well, he also admitted that only Yoko could sell a cow for that much amount. If you're liking this content so far, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Now let's continue. Well, in Beatles lore, no person is as divisive or debatable as Yoko Ono, who was the lover and eventual bride of John Lennon. She arrived inside the scene when the band was facing its difficult hardships. It was a time of deep loss, psychological questioning, and bitter infighting over leadership and business that would finally end in the band's break. Coming off his acid period, Ono showed Lennon another way. With Epstein gone, McCartney walked into the role of quasi-manager in a try to keep the band on track. In February 1968, the band went to study transcendental meditations in India. Disappointed with the teacher and aware he was not getting at the solace he wanted, Lennon returned to London, where he left his wife Cynthia to start a relationship with Ono after the recording of their first musical collaborations, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. It was reported that John was spinning coming off his acid period, undergoing the psychological loss of Brian Epstein, and having his great disappointment in India. He was extremely vulnerable and relapsed back into acid. The timing of it was very much in line with his psychological neediness and him expecting to replace something else. He doesn't go all in on Yoko until he becomes disillusioned. In 2012, McCartney told Frost, when Yoko came along, part of her temptations was her avant-garde side, her views of things. So, she showed him another way to be which was very attractive to him. Ono was even allowed in the studio where no other wives or girlfriends of John Lennon were allowed. Once a background figure, Lennon now ushered Ono into the inner circle, in doing so making her this join at the hip figure, bringing her into the Beatle world where no other wives or girlfriends were ever permitted that status in the studio. However, Yoko broke up with the Beatles because she was the one that disturbed the order of things. But it was John who was in influence in hiding behind her as he brought her in. The stories about her accompanying him to the bathroom during studio sessions allowed her to say what she would say later. Lennon was using her, but she was also becoming part of something that generally they would have been wise enough to recognize was disruptive to the Beatles' working patterns. The other Beatles were extremely tolerant and patient. Paul was actually the guy who was pushing and struggling to hold the band together at the time, was also bending over backwards to be accommodating. With that being said, it's time to end our today's video. Press the like button and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stuff. Peace out.